We're ready to begin our next session for the morning. The Tartan Turban, In Search of Alexander Gardner. John Keay in conversation with Shiv Visvanathan. John Keay has been writing about India for over 40 years. His India, A History is the standard narrative account of South Asia's past, while India Discovered has inspired a generation of research into the 19th century reconstruction of India's classical past. Shiv Visvanathan is professor at Jindal Global Law School, Sonipat. He is an Indian public intellectual and social scientist, best known for his contributions to science and technology studies and for the concept of cognitive justice, a term that he coined. Please welcome John Keay and Shiv Visvanathan, The Tartan Turban, In Search of Alexander Gardner.
So I can have the last one.
I just wanted to say, first of all, what a wonderful festival this has been and how much I've enjoyed it, and to thank the organisers and particularly all of you who make the festival what it is. I think probably the best in India, not perhaps the biggest, not perhaps the oldest, but certainly the most challenging and sharp-witted. So it's been a real pleasure. Anyway, writing the first book devoted to a man who died 150 years ago may seem a little bit perverse. It could be argued that if it's taken 150 years for someone to write a biography of Alexander Gardner, he can't have been very famous. Either that or not enough is known about him, both of which are true up to a point. But the main reason biographers have fought shy of Gardner is that what is known about him is so suspect. In fact, most of Gardner's story was so outrageously improbable as to be unbelievable. His most determined critics went somewhere towards proving this. They dismissed him as a plagiarist, a fantasist, a downright liar, and a scoundrel to boot. His reputation, never more than precarious, plummeted. Ousted from the library shelves reserved for history, biography, or travel, the few surviving copies of Gardner's memoirs were reshelved beside the fabrications of George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman and the absurdities concocted by Baron Munchausen. Now, I have to confess that I too have had my doubts. I first encountered Gardner about 40 years ago, when I was writing about 19th century exploration in the Western Himalaya. His story was too good to ignore, but it was also too dodgy for what was supposed to be a serious piece of scholarship. And in a later history of exploration, I actually left him out altogether. It was easy enough to dispense with Gardner the explorer. Rarely, if ever, did his travels mesh with anyone else's or attract their approval. The term maverick could have been invented especially for him. But I found it less easy to forget about Gardner the man. For one thing, there was the portrait. Until 5 years ago, when the research for this book got underway, there was only one known photograph of Colonel Alexander Haughton Campbell Gardner, and this was it. It was taken in Kashmir in the 1860s by the Shimla photographer Samuel Bourne, and it immediately caught the popular imagination. In fact, as a trope for cultural crossover, it crops up so often that one can't help wondering whether the mention of Gardner in a text wasn't just an excuse for including the portrait. In other words, the image acquired a life of its own, while the life of the man it portrayed was largely disbelieved. But there were exceptions, and this was the exciting bit. Sometimes the image was even credited with mirroring the man, for did it not portray precisely the sort of raffish figure one might expect of a white man, Ghan native, who had spent the best part of his life as a hired gun in the wilder parts of Inner Asia. The first prose portraits of Gardner date from 1864, the same year as the photograph. Rumour had spread amongst British holidaymakers in the Kashmir capital of Srinagar that somewhere in that city's maze of alleys and canals, there lived in oriental seclusion with his several wives a famed veteran who had once led a band of irregulars in Afghanistan and was now colonel in command of the Kashmir Maharaja's artillery, and who, despite living as a native and observing local festivals and taboos, was really a European in disguise. The British commissioner, who was like a resident in Srinagar, made inquiries. An invitation was issued, Bourne, the photographer, was alerted, and at the appointed hour, the mysterious colonel duly presented himself at the commissioner's residence. I can perfectly recollect my first interview with him, wrote Commissioner Cooper. He walked into the reception room one morning, a most peculiar and striking apparition, clothed from head to foot in the 79th Highland tartan, but fashioned by a local tailor. Even his puggree, his turban, was of tartan, and it was adorned with an egret's plume, only allowed to persons of high rank. I imagine he lived entirely in native fashion. He was said to be wealthy and the owner of many villages. The old colonel, while on the verge of his 80th year, had a gait as firm as a man of 50. Some 6 feet in height, he usually wore the tartan plaid suit, but the photograph gives but a dim idea of the vivacity of expression, the humour of the mouth, and the energy of character portrayed by the whole aspect of the man, as he described the arduous and terrible incidents of a long life of romance and vicissitude. Over the next few months, the commissioner got to know Colonel Gardner quite well. He persuaded him to tell his story at some length, and he took notes as he did so. In the course of these interviews, he observed other peculiarities. Gardner claimed to carry the scars of 15 wounds about his person. Most were, of course, concealed underneath all that tartan, but with one exception, and this was a hole in his neck that obliged the colonel, whenever he ate or drank, to clamp the hole shut by thrusting into his jungle of beard a pair of steel forceps. Along with a shortage of teeth, a liking for strong spirits, and his decidedly rusty English, this impediment could make Gardner rather difficult to understand. But Commissioner Cooper persisted. There was no question in his mind that his story was genuine and that he was indeed a white man. His precise nationality, however, remained a mystery. Notwithstanding his decision to be photographed as a tartan-clad Highlander, his accent struck some as more Irish than Scottish, and in Central Asia, his preferred alias had been that of an Arab sheikh. Yet, on his own admission, his mother had been part Spanish, part Aztec, and to cap it all, on the strength of a childhood spent crisscrossing North America, the colonel himself was adamant that he was, in fact, an American citizen. How someone who claimed to have been born in what is now Wisconsin and educated at a mission school in Arizona had fetched up in Central Asia only added to the mystery surrounding the colonel. An older brother had apparently preceded him as far as Russia, which would help explain his move to the east, but as a schoolboy on the Mexican border, Alexander had already hankered after the independent life of a frontiersman, or as he put it to Commissioner Cooper in Kashmir, from this early period, the notion of being a traveller and adventurer and of somehow, somewhere, carving out a name for myself was a maggot of my brain. Restless yet aimless, even Gardner seems to have forgotten what became of the rest of his youth. Sometimes he'd hint at a spell in the Navy as a gunner, sometimes at a sojourn in Ireland, completing his education, and sometimes at a residence in Spain, sorting out his deceased mother's estate. Whatever the reason behind his crossing the Atlantic, the incentive for swapping continents yet again by crossing the Mediterranean to Egypt was clear. The East was where opportunity lay. In the late 18th century, a number of European officers had found fame and fortune by raising private armies for native rulers in Asia. Many of these adventurers and mercenaries were French, like de Bourne and Perron, who famously commanded the Maratha troops against the British. Others campaigned on their own account or in alliance with whoever would best reward them. George Thomas, a red-haired Irish giant who was known as a Tipperary Raja, first put his troops at the disposal of the Begum Samru and her overlord, the Mughal emperor. Here in this picture, you can see Thomas, he's on the top left-hand corner, leading his troops in the field. He then tried to carve out a kingdom for himself in what is now Haryana. Gardner certainly heard tell of Thomas, and after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, he noted reports of a new wave of ex-Napoleonic officers heading east to find employment with the Emir of Afghanistan, the Shah of Persia, or more especially, Ranjit Singh, the up-and-coming Sikh Maharaja of Lahore in the Punjab. In due course, Gardner would follow their example, but not for at least 12 years. Instead, and still with no clear purpose in mind, he first undertook a sensational succession of exploratory marathons across the unknown lands between the Caspian Sea, the Gobi Desert, and Tibet. Geographers would be hopelessly divided, and they still are, about these travels. Long before reputable explorers had ventured north of Afghanistan, Gardner had apparently crisscrossed what are now Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. He traversed the treeless tundra of the Pamir Mountains, trodden the Silk Road through Chinese Xinjiang, and scaled the highest passes in the western Himalaya. In the process, he'd sustained those 15 wounds, been mauled by wolves, repeatedly robbed, and nearly sold into slavery. As one nonplussed admirer would put it, his explorations were positively handicapped by adventure. And all this he had managed with no preparation or training, without the benefit even of a compass, let alone maps, and for the most part alone, but for a few Afghan fugitives. Often he too was on the run. Most explorers aim to get somewhere. Gardner's aim was usually to get away from somewhere. The first and second of his great journeys began on the Caspian Sea and crisscrossed the deserts between there and Afghanistan. Dates like distances very rarely feature in the Colonel's reminiscing, but it must now have been about 1821, and he would have been in his 30s. 2 years later, he set off again. He reached Samarkand. He fell foul of a gang of raiders. He was sold into slavery. Then he was rescued. And from Turkestan, he eventually crossed the Oxus River into even more unruly Afghanistan. At this point, a plan of sorts emerged, and he wanted to serve or get a commission from the Emir, Dost Muhammad, in Kabul. But in fact, he managed to end up by signing on with Dost Muhammad's great rival, and he conducted a sort of guerrilla warfare on behalf of this rival for the throne of Afghanistan. So the first American to reach Afghanistan also became the first American to fight in Afghanistan. There followed what he called a life in the saddle, one of active warfare and continual forays for the good cause of right against wrong. He was blessed by the acquisition of a young bride. She bore him a son, and they made their home in a fortress near Bagram, where the US Army base was. He says, he told Commissioner Cooper, I was very happy for about 2 years, but I must hurry over this part of my story. What happened eventually is that his forces were defeated, his wife and child were killed, and he set off on the last of his great journeys as a kind of fugitive, really, from Afghanistan. So he's hounded by his enemies in Afghanistan. He headed north into what was then called Kafiristan, it's now called Nuristan in eastern Afghanistan, and then to Badakhshan in extreme northeast of Afghanistan, then across the Oxus River into the Pamirs, through the Pamirs to Kyrgyzstan, where he spent a winter hunting, really, with the locals, and then he crossed to the Alai Mountains, descended into Xinjiang, passed through, this is the Pamirs, and passed through Yarkand, which you see here, which is now called Sache, on the road south towards Leh in Ladakh, which he reached, and then to Kashmir, and eventually after 2 years of wandering, ended up back in Kafiristan, in Chichal, and then in Kafiristan. He then again attempted to find employment. This is Kafiristan. He attempted to find employment in Afghanistan. He did fight for a while against a jihadist fanatic in Bajaur in northern Pakistan, and then he managed to get employed by Maharaja Ranjit Singh of the Punjab, who'd heard about his exploits. So he descended the Khyber Pass and arrived in Lahore in about 1832. His 12 years as a Central Asian traveller were over. Not till 30 years later would he tell his story to Commissioner Cooper in Kashmir. Not till 20 years after his death would a heavily edited version of it be published. This book, which is billed as his memoirs, was a success. Reviewers were amazed that his story was so little known. Even geographers mostly gave him the benefit of the doubt. But his improbable discoveries of lost civilizations, colossal effigies, ruby mines, and so on, strained credibility, while the lack of dates and distances and bearings and place names posed a problem for later travelers. Until his roots could be retraced and his discoveries confirmed, his itineraries authenticated, no explorer could be sure of being the first anywhere in Central Asia. Typical of those who rose to the challenge was George Heywood, here posing with his sporting trophies before making a final bid of his own to reach the Pamirs. Heywood had the support of the Royal Geographical Society in London and the advantage of being able to consult Gardner himself. The two men were seen together in Kashmir in 1870, and Heywood's outfit was probably suggested by Gardner, and his itinerary was certainly informed by Gardner, none of which would avail the hapless Heywood. A few weeks after taking leave of Gardner in Kashmir, he was hacked to death just one pass short of the Oxus at the point where the colonel had supposedly crossed it 4 years earlier. There's no question that Gardner did embellish his travels. He exaggerated the hairbreadth escapes and he overdid the mysterious discoveries. But by the time he unburdened himself to Commissioner Cooper, he was over 70, and it was all a very long time ago. Like all great travelers, in the words of Benjamin Disraeli, like all great travelers, he had seen more than he remembered, and remembered more than he had seen. Oddly, nothing argues more strongly in favor of Gardner not having invented his travels than the reliability of his testimony as to what followed. Lahore offered Gardner all that he craved. Staggering wealth was there for the winning, along with ample occasion for indulgence and ever more perilous assignments. But they came soured by cutthroat intrigue and laced with dire consequences. From the bloodletting, there was no escape. Gardner would be as deeply implicated as anyone, and he admitted as much. His vivid account of the last years of the Sikh Empire, and with it his admission of culpability, would subsequently be authenticated and find its way into the history books. He may have dramatized the carnage, but there's nothing to suggest he invented or falsified it. For the first 3 years in Lahore, all had gone to plan. As a colonel of artillery, Gardner Sahib, slotted into Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Fargy Class, or Royal Brigade, and was handsomely remunerated. Further perks included a half share of the 40,000 rupees offered by the Maharaja for the construction of a paddle steamer. The vessel that Gardner designed was not actually a steamer, it was much more like a pedalo bristling with ordnance. And despite the best efforts of 20 burly paddlers turning the paddle handles against the current of the Ravi River, it went only a few yards. Ranjit Singh was delighted that it went at all. His officers had matched the achievements of Western science. The Sikh Empire might yet have a navy. The Fargy Class was the Maharaja's new model army. It was drilled on European lines and commanded by former Napoleonic officers, Jean-Baptiste Ventura for the infantry and Jean-François Jean-François Alain for the cavalry. On the assistance of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, here in his youth, all of them, Gardner included, were obliged to conform to Sikh custom by abstaining from beef, from tobacco, and from barbers, and to take on an Indian wife. The wives were to ensure the foreigners' loyalties and to report on any hint of treachery, as well as to provide home comforts. But they came and went with the job. So when Gardner was transferred from the Maharaja's employ to that of his chief minister, the minister provided him with a new wife from his own household. The chief minister was Dayan Singh, one of three alarmingly able and ambitious brothers from Jammu. You can see them sitting on the left here, the three brothers. Though Hindus rather than Sikhs, the Duggar Brothers were more trusted by the Maharaja than his own family. Each commanded large numbers of troops, and while the suave Dayan Singh exercised sway at court, his elder brother, Gulab Singh, terrorized Kashmir and the kingdom's hill districts. Unwittingly, Gardner had entered the service of Lahore's most powerful clan, indeed its would-be kingmakers. For the next 40 years, in the Punjab and latterly in Kashmir, he would be answerable to a Dogra, first to Dayan Singh, then Gulab Singh on the elephant, and during his final days in Kashmir, Gulab Singh's son, Ranbir Singh. As kingmakers, these Duggar brothers came into their own in 1839. In that year, 1839, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, now grey-whiskered old boy, died, and in the same year, the British invaded Afghanistan in what they called the First Afghan War. Either event would have destabilized India's northwestern approaches, and for Lahore, the combination of the two was fatal. The meteoric rise of the Sikh kingdom had not gone unnoticed by its British neighbours, but as long as Ranjit Singh lived, cordial relations between Calcutta and Lahore had prevailed. Originally, the Afghan war had been projected as a joint Anglo-Sikh invasion. But now in Lahore, elements at court and in the army rightly saw the massing of British forces on their doorstep for Afghanistan as a possible prelude to an assault on the Punjab as well. Likewise, in British India, it was rightly supposed that the Sikh succession would be hotly contested and could well provide the pretext for precisely such an assault. In Lahore, contenders for the throne now came and went so rapidly that a roll call of their names is less informative than a list of how each was eliminated. The causes of death amongst these power brokers in the 5 years after 1839 are given as follows: poisoned, crushed by falling masonry, stoned to death, shot at point-blank range, beheaded, shot in the back, massacred by his own troops, strangled and cut up for fish food, and ritually assassinated. 5 Maharajas and 4 chief ministers rose and were felled in the space of 5 years, leaving in the end a 6-year-old child who was probably not of the blood royal and would necessitate a long and no less contested regency. Gardner's take on events was that the bloodletting was being masterminded by his employers, the devious Duggar Brothers. He accompanied them on the murderous raid that began all the carnage, and when Dayan Singh himself was assassinated, he happily enlisted with even more bloodthirsty Gulab Singh. At a critical moment in Gulab Singh's struggle to hold the Lahore fort and secure its spectacular treasure, it was Gardner and his guns who blew the assailants to smithereens and saved the day. Nevertheless, the ebb and flow of power occasionally obliged him to lie low. In search of an unlikely alias, he was probably the only non-Sikh ever to be admitted to the brotherhood of the fanatical and half-naked warriors known as the Akalis. After the exodus of all Ranjit Singh's other foreign recruits, he was certainly the only foreign officer on hand to witness the fatal breakdown in relations between the army and the court. He was also, in the words of one of his critics, the only foreigner to disgrace the land of his birth by an act of utter depravity. The act in question was one of judicial mutilation. In 1845, as the rift between the court and the rank and file of the army widens, Gardner's services were commandeered by the outrageous Rani Jindal and her brother, who was about to be chief minister. They looked to Gardner for the defense of the Lahore fort and the detention of the state prisoners held there. In this role, on orders from the Rani's brother, it fell to Gardner to oversee the sentence on a Brahmin general called Jodha Ram. The sentence was one of amputation of the hands, nose, and ears. And when no one else could be found to perform it, Gardner Sahib, Gardner himself, wielded the razor. Such was the so-called Jodha Ram affair. In a city that was racked by strife, accustomed to multiple killings, teetering on the brink of civil war, and about to face a full-scale invasion, it was a distasteful incident, but one compounded by the victim being a high-born Brahmin. But by the standards of the day, it was not exactly an atrocity. No party saw fit to hold Gardner to account, even when within weeks the army assassinated the Rani's brother in revenge. Gardner was not molested.
John, somewhere we have to have a conversation. Decide.
Well, I would, let me just give you a brief outline of what happened after that. And the British invaded the Punjab in 1845, replaced the Sikh administration, dismissed Gardner from his employment in the Sikh army, and he went off, served briefly in Multan in Sindh as a military contractor, and then retired in his old age to Kashmir, where he became a pensioner of Gulab Singh, one of the Duggar brothers, who'd been made the first Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir. Gardner spent the last years of his life in Srinagar, and that was where he met people like Commissioner Cooper, who I was quoting from at the beginning. He also met a lot of other, the editor of the Times of India, I remember, described him as someone. There was something almost appalling to hear this ancient warrior discourse of what have now become almost prehistoric times, relate his experiences in the service. So he was widely credited. One of the people who knew him best of all was someone called Charlie Longfellow, who was the son of the poet who wrote the Hiawatha. Charlie Longfellow, who was, of course, an American, had no doubt that Gardner's story was true, and he actually became very attached to the old colonel. Gardner died in 1877 in Jammu. He was buried in the nearest church, which was in Sialkot at the time, and there was a slight question mark about why he was buried there, since he appeared to have become a Muslim at some stage in his career, and certainly he detested Christian missionaries and was very, very critical of British rule. One of the joys of this book was finding a few more portraits of Gardner. Here he is, not looking 6 foot, but with his bodyguard in Kashmir. Here's another photograph of him which turned up, and then that's the place of his burial. And this is a famous painting of him, the only known painting of him, which was rediscovered as part of the research for the book. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry to go on. I certainly need to have a drink of water. So I'll pass you over to Shiv.
Thank you, John. I was fascinated with the book, but I was equally fascinated by the presentation. Here is an Englishman obsessed with imperialism. No, wait. Let's do that. Because I think we'll have to look at something carefully here. I was just listening to the last session on India-Pakistan. There was no mention of evil. Here is a man who actually studies evil. But it's very strange. You talk of all the lineaments of evil, but you refuse to pass a judgment at a certain point. Why I'm asking this question is, do you think imperialism needed the subconscious of evil to justify itself?
I mean, I don't accept this idea of imperialism. Gardner had very uncertain relationships with the British. He was employed by Ranjit Singh, not by the British.
No, but that's the category I want to come to. You know, this whole category of the Ferengi as an ambivalent category of Englishmen and foreigners working for native kings creates a certain ambivalence about imperialism. They become a kind of middle ground where to a certain extent you provide a critique of local princes, you provide a critique of colonialism, yet that very moral ambivalence becomes fascinating. I mean, you do the reverse of a devil's advocacy. You try to almost exonerate Gardner. Why? And in this context,
I'm not really trying to...
No. If you look at the novel, it's fantastic. The book, it's fantastic. It's actually a forensic case. I wish there was a 19th century Nuremberg, because then you'd be one of the foremost lawyers of that.
I'm not trying to exonerate Gardner. I'm trying to authenticate his story. This is what the book is about. So it's much more about substantiating a very doubtful story on the face of it, rather than about trying to pass judgment on his conduct. He was obviously a man, he brought the kind of morality of the Wild West, of the American West, to the East, really. He was obviously very unscrupulous. He was accused of joining in the slave trade. He was enslaved himself at one point. He was totally disapproved of by the British. I mentioned, actually I didn't, but he had a relationship with Henry Lawrence, the man who became the great sort of hero of British imperialism and was killed at the siege of Lucknow. And Lawrence first used him as a kind of informant about what was happening in Lahore, and then completely dropped him when he heard about this mutilation case that I was talking about. So that even his contemporaries thought he was a bit below the normal level of acceptable...
Now, the question I want to ask is that enough? Because what fascinates me is, here is a brilliant discussion of colonialism, violence, and evil by an Englishman completely conversant with that area, who refuses to pass judgment in a very interesting way. Now,
Well,
wait, let me push you, because I think in the very act of being a forensic study of Gardner, the analyst also becomes the case study. Let me push you, just a minute. What is your notion of evil, John? Because, you know, you write this book as if heat can only be measured by temperature. And you seem to think evil can only be measured by atrocity. But you rarely comment on it except towards the end. Now, if I were a native, let me play native, not nationalist. I'd say, what's this guy saying? In fact, my first reaction when I read halfway through the book, let me be candid, was, what's this bloody Englishman saying? He writes beautiful English. Wait, let me, I'm going to push you, Raj.
I'm not an Englishman, I'm Scottish.
No, I know, but that's precisely what I'm going to push. There's a representation of that. And the thing I want to ask you is, this is brilliant history without a single act of psychoanalysis. Would you like to psychoanalyze Gardner in the book?
I mean, we simply don't know enough about Gardner. His own writings are very, very limited. So how do you possibly psychoanalyze?
No, I love your empiricism. But I want you to push the fact that here you're discussing fantasy, you're discussing frontier, you're discussing colonialism, which are really acts of the imagination. And you produce a book which is like a measuring rod. Why?
It isn't about colonialism at all. I mean, Gardner had nothing to do with colonialism. The British disowned him. He was an American.
I know, but that doesn't exonerate him. You know, you can't say...
He claimed that Americans were victims of colonialism.
Yeah, I know, he claimed a lot of things, and you'd like to...
Quite right,
but
too.
Look, here's a complex character. Why are you making him so antiseptic at one level?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a historian's job to pass judgment at every opportunity. And second thing is actually all this never really occurred to me. When my book came out, it was almost exactly the same time as Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire, what the British did to India. A number of people made the point that surely this was about the best defense they'd ever heard of the imposition of British rule in India. If this is what life was like, say, in Lahore in 1846, no wonder there was a case for the imposition of British. That actually never even occurred to me when I was writing the book. I wasn't trying to comment on imperialism at all. And it was only someone in an audience at a gathering like this who raised this question. So this isn't, when you say I write about imperialist history, I don't actually. Most of my books
No, but that's the question I'm
earlier
asking.
Indian history.
No, but that's fascinating. I mean, why the blinders? Is it a methodological step? Is it a way of trying to find a new way of looking at 19th century history? Or is there some personal search in this whole fascination?
I think there's a slight element of kind of disassociate myself from the sort of imperial defenses that you're talking about. I don't think I've ever really subscribed to that, and I've certainly never, unlike most people who write, British people who write about India, I don't really have any family connections with British rule. People like Charles Allen and William Dalrymple obviously do. Charles was born here and so on. I don't. I mean, the only relation I ever had who worked here actually worked in Nagaland, and he wasn't terribly keen on India. He was very keen on the Nagas. I don't have any connections, and I never really had a great deal of interest in the British period. But in terms of this book, it does happen to coincide with the expansion, or the final stage of the expansion of British rule. You're quite right. But the book is not about history. This is a biography, or it's a biographical quest.
But a biography is located in history. A biography is located in sociology. So I'm saying, will the real John Keay stand up? The real Alexander Gardner is out. I think there's somewhere that I see a ritual avoidance in your language, in your forensic use of metaphor, which avoids the question of, is all this violence make sense to you? I mean, look at the way you describe the question of the cutting of ears of the Brahmin. I've never seen such an antiseptic narrative of an act of violence. Why?
What, you think I should be appalled and...
You could be appalled.
Shed tears and...
No, you do not shed tears. Yeah. It's not very British. But you could make at one level some comment, because in a way, the very absence of comment makes you wonder, what is the author thinking at each stage?
I don't think...
Because I don't think... Let's forget Shashi Tharoor.
I want the reader to think. I don't want him to worry about what the author's thinking.
Okay, but that's where I'm coming. No, when the reader thinks, he also questions the author. That's why I said there are two acts of psychoanalysis involved here. One, Alexander Gardner. Two, John Keay. Now, that's why I said, here's a chance for the real John Keay to stand up. What is your view of this period? And what is your sense of morality and evil that took place in this era? Or do you think a biography can be pulled out from the context of the era?
My thoughts about this period are those of someone of my generation. I was born in 1941, and I first came to India in the early 1960s. So I have no real experience of what British rule here was like, and no personal experience whatsoever. Someone like me, of my age, has imbibed from a very early age, certainly from school, a detestation of imperial methods. And so we tend to be very, very cautious when talking about these subjects, and not to try and express opinions one way or the other. I hate being portrayed as an imperialist apologist. Nothing could be further from the truth. I suggest you read some of my other books. And the other thing is, I don't actually think it's up to historians to pass judgment.
Why not? No, wait.
Because if you want to trust what I'm saying, you don't want to.
No, but there's a notion of and there's a notion of methodology which verges on a certain kind of morality. Look at your rituals of distancing. I'm not too British. I had no one in the family here. True. But I think at one level, what you're looking at is one of the most violent periods of history, partly verging on the genocidal. No comment from John Keay, who's now one of the great representative historians of this period. Why? No, but that's why he said, you're inviting the reader to think. And as one reader who read your book intensively over the last week, an impossible assignment, why do you keep this distance? Is it part of objectivity or truth, or is it some sense of trying to create a different narrative?
No, I mean, this is just a normal, I hope, scholarly reaction to any subject, whatever I'm writing about. I don't want to become engaged. I don't want to be seen as someone who's intensely partisan. I don't believe in history being used for purposes, whether they're political or ethnic or racial or whatever.
No, John, that's exactly where I want to intervene. History is being used.
It is being used, but I
No,
try
but that's
not
the
to.
comment I want to make. At a time when every regime is using history as a political weapon, your act of distancing makes you different. Now, the question is, at the same time, you have to comment on these guys. What's your sense of Gardner? Okay, not quite British, a touch of the American, a Ferengi, caught in the ambivalence of two corrupt regimes. But you leave it at that. At the same time, I just want to wonder, what do you think informally of this period? I can see the scholarship, I can see the language, but somewhere in the language and the scholarship is something forced, something artificial.
I think maybe
as a reader, I want to just probe
I should explain something about the genesis of this book.
Yeah.
I first came across Gardner's story a long time ago, as I said, when I was writing about exploration in the Himalaya, and I really didn't give it a lot of thought, until quite recently when I was approached by a publisher which I'd never heard of, a Sikh publisher. I didn't know there were any Sikh publishers in the United Kingdom who said, would I do a biography? I said, no, I really didn't think there was enough material and so on. And they said, oh, well, they would help with the research. So a lot of the research for the book and the publishing was done by the Sikh community in Britain, by something called the United Kingdom Punjab Heritage Association, who have a publishing house called Kashi House. Since they'd commissioned the work, I obviously was attentive to their concerns, and so there's perhaps rather more about Gardner's period in Lahore than I would have included had I been just doing it as a straight biography. So that's certainly true, and certainly the publishers have an interest in this period of Sikh history of Ranjit Singh and are very keen to collect materials relative to the period and to do a lot of research, particularly picture research for this book. So it had a slightly unusual genesis, and it would have been very weird if I'd taken the very kind of imperialist line on it. And I think they were fairly sure I wouldn't. And I said all along that I wasn't going to take sides on this at all. We would just conduct an inquiry into the veracity, the authenticity of Gardner's story, and that's what the book is about.
And that's, to me, both the limit and the excitement of the book.
Well, yes.
No, wait, I just want to push it, because I think at one level you're speaking to a group which has recovered from colonialism, imperialism, which can't forget it. At the same time, here comes a book which says,
I don't agree with this characterization of British rule in India as colonialist. It was imperialist.
Okay.
Colonialist implies settlement on a large scale. There was comparatively little.
No, but I think there were elements of both in the mentality. Now, here is what I want to look at. The very fact you pick exploration as an idea, the question of the frontier, the question of these kind of geographies,
yes.
Do you think it was very important for the British imagination?
The geography was important.
No, exploration as an
Exploration,
idea.
of course, yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
What do you think it did in terms of geography, morality, evil science?
in terms of morality, I don't think many explorers were concerned with morality. I think probably explorers were not actually a very nice bunch of people, any of them.
Now, that's what I'm worried about.
I don't think but as I say, it's not for the historian to pass judgment on all these people. It's, one is presenting the facts. You can obviously form
John,
your
okay,
own judgment on it.
Let me give you a
That's
simple...
fine, that's
No,
what
John, let me just tempt you for a minute, because I know you're avoiding a question. I'm making you a 19th century lawyer on the 19th century. We are having a Nuremberg on imperialism. Now, what's your argument for John Gardner?
What's my argument?
For Gardner,
For
in
Gardner.
this kind of man. You think he's just a creature of the context?
I don't think he's an imperialist at all. He's an anti-imperialist. He actually was very critical of British rule. He wrote a number of diatribes against the British, and particularly against Christian missionaries.
So what you're arguing, he's a convincing No, are you saying he's a convincing hypocrite?
No, I think he was genuinely
critical.
critical.
To be, because when you look at your argument, you're saying, here is a guy...
He had nothing to gain by being critical of British rule. If anything, he might have swung to the opposite extreme, but actually he was very critical. He was somewhat inarticulate very often. He was one of those people who...
Oh, you wander between inarticulateness and the fact that he had fantasies of all kinds. You know,
I don't say he...
No, I think there's certain ambivalences and tensions in the book I found fascinating. In fact, after a while, I was not interested in Gardner, I was interested in John Keay. No, because...
I hate to be identified with him.
Look. With Dalrymple, with John Harris, with you, all of you are trying to create a new space for a certain kind of imperialist imagination. I feel as an Indian scholar, I should respond to it, even if it irritates you. I hope it irritates you. Because to a certain extent, I think you've got to ask these questions. When you straddle this period, without a single act of judgment, what does it know? I think it's an important question. Would you write about Hitler in the same way? No, wait, here is a guy...
I would try to. I would try to write as dispassionately about Hitler as I do about Gardner.
But that is precisely...
I mean, whether I succeeded is not a matter.
Now I'm coming to the question. Let's take your book, and let's take a book like Hannah Arendt, where she eventually shows the very objectivity of looking at this period did not make you understand what happened. There's a sense of evil. There's a tremendous sense of evil running through your book. Decadence, violence, betrayal. I've never seen a book so antiseptically treat all these categories. And I'm worried.
I don't recognize this book at all. This sounds like someone else's book you're talking about.
That's precisely why I said, will the real John Keay stand up? Because the book I read didn't seem to tally with your other books. In this sense, that here you're talking about a guy who's a scoundrel, a mercenary, an adventurer, and he looks pretty antiseptic at the end.
What do you mean by antiseptic?
You exonerate him.
Oh, I don't think I do.
No.
I mean, as I say, I try not to...
No, I think...
Authenticate, yes. Exonerate, no.
Authenticate,
I don't do.
Yes. But are you just verifying an archaeological text? Or are you in... No, there is a moral imagination to writing, John. But it's old-fashioned. No, you can be as scientific as you like, as objective as you want. Yeah, we are coming. Just 1 minute. I know. Okay. Let the audience have the question because Ram wants to interview.
I'm actually very hard to hear, so you have to interpret the questions for me.
Okay, let's have the questions.
Here's one.
Anand Giri, can you give a mic?
Thank you so much. And, Shiv, you mentioned about psychoanalyzing, right? But at the same time, what about the challenge of psychoanalyzing the reader? And about the category of judgment, including judgment, historical judgment, can there be a modality of confident judgment, or there could be a kind of non-judgmental judgment? It seems that hearing you might be pushing us for a judgment which is very confident. So how do we participate in a journey of understanding which is in between understanding and a kind of emerging judgment which itself is not too totalizing?
Is that to me or him? Okay, but let's take a few questions to John Keay first. I think that's important. Any questions to Keay?
Mr. Viswanathan.
Yeah.
See, I think he's been consistent, frankly, because I think John Keay has been consistent, frankly, because in an earlier book, for example, he writes about a Nayar Rani from Kerala who invited a bunch of British East India Company people over for dinner, murdered all of them, sent this person floating down river with his tongue nailed to his chest. Now, he mentions all this, he writes all this equally antiseptically or clinically. That's his style. That's the way we'd like it. Why should he pass judgment on the Nayar Rani of Kerala?
Look, you're looking at two genocidal centuries. If you think consistency is enough for a narrative, I think you'll have to ask deeper questions. I'm sorry, even if it makes me unpopular with this crowd, you have to look at history and violence in a different way. Anyway, any more questions?
Hello. Yeah. You know,
Yeah.
I just had a thought. While it was an amazing presentation, there were words that were used, and the choice of words didn't seem neutral all the time, because when the Afghan comes in, or there are several kings that come in, there was the word fanatic used with them very often. So I was curious to see how neutral the word fanatic is versus otherwise being neutral about Gardner. And I think that subtext, which is the unstated, I'm curious about. Not the stated, the unstated subtext. Yeah, thank you.
The word fanatic, I agree, is very loaded, and it's something I actually try and avoid. But funnily enough, it was the editor, who was a Sikh on this book, who said, we always describe Akalis as fanatics, so it's okay. So on that basis, I thought I could get away with it. But I agree with you. I don't like using words like that at all.
Okay, quick wrap up, John, and we'll stop. Any final comments?
Yes.
Discord.
Yes, we had some of this discussion yesterday. I can't remember which event it was, about the role of history. All I would say is that this is not history, it's a biography. It's not meant to be a history of the period. It's not meant to convey any idea about imperialism particularly. It's a biography. It's my first attempt at a biography, in fact. It would have been nice to have more kind of psychological analysis, but the materials didn't support it. And so I thought it was more important to present the materials as we have them and let the reader make their own judgment, as you have, Chief. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, kindly note that authors will be available for book signings and interactions outside the auditorium. Thank you so much, sir. Carnatic musician Vignesh Ishwar will be performing at 1 o'clock today